are really excited to have some really wonderful speakers gather today. So before we get started, I'll just do a few really quick housekeeping items. Um, First, as you all have probably realized, that we are in Zoom webinar, not Zoom meeting. So I know that sometimes the controls are a little bit different. So just wanted to point out and also mention that because this is a coffee talk, although we are in webinar mode, we still want to have conversation with you all. So once we get to the time where we'll have discussion and time for questions and answers, we will allow you to unmute. So I just wanted to point that out, that in the audio settings, once it comes time for that, that's how you can unmute in the left-hand corner. We also do have cart captioning today. So if you see on your Zoom settings bar, you should be able to enable the captions there. You can show subtitles and or the full transcript. If you have a question or have a technology need, please let us know just by sending us a chat, and we can help with that. And or you can raise your hand as well. So what's really exciting about our Autism Acceptance Month events is that we have so many wonderful people joining us from organizations that may be unfamiliar with our organization here at AMCHIP. So AMCHIP is an acronym for our organization, which is the Association of Maternal and Child Health Programs. And at AMCHIP, we vision a nation that values and invests in the health and well-being of all women, children, youth, families, and communities so that they may thrive. And we are an association, so our membership stems from leaders and staff at state and territorial health agencies, as well as their partners who implement programs to improve the health of women, children, and families. So at our organization, we have the State Public Health Autism Resource Center, funded by the Maternal and Child Health Bureau of Health Resources and Services Administration. And at our resource center, SPHARC, which you can see the website here on the screen, what we do is we really want to help states build capacity to implement systems of care. And something that we've really been trying to do as of late is really walk the walk and make sure that we're elevating the voices of those who are most impacted by those systems of care. So in this case, that's our wonderful autistic advocates. So today we're joined by two really wonderful humans who are going to lead us in a conversation, and it looks like tech difficulties got sorted out for Jess, and she is here, which is great. So hi Jess. So before I turn it over to our esteemed speakers today, I'll just introduce them really briefly. Have their pictures here, and if they feel so inclined, they could turn their cameras on as well. So today we're joined by Lydia XC Brown. They are an advocate, educator, and attorney, and associated with the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. And then we have Dr. Jessica Horvath Williams, associated with the University of Minnesota, Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. So I am not the expert here, so I'm going to turn it over to the experts, but I'm here if anyone has any questions. We do have the Q&A box enabled, so please send in your questions there as well as the chat. But I'm going to turn it over to Jess and Lydia. Thank you.
This is Lydia XC Brown, they, them pronouns. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses, wearing a dark shirt for CDT, the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'm in a room that has 2 windows with blinds behind me. And I want to invite everybody to just take a moment of pause and grounding, to tune in to our body minds, to check in with our access needs. And I extend this invitation to Paige and Jess and Maura as well. Let's take a moment of pause. Do you need to grab something to eat? Do you need to grab something to drink, move around, change your position, lie down, scream into the void like the cicadas all night long? Let's take that moment of listening and tuning into our body-minded needs about where they are. Let's breathe. Let's meet ourselves where we are at. Please do lie down. I see in the chat that someone has said that. You are welcome and invited to be on a couch, a bed, a beanbag chair, the floor, wherever is most comfortable for your body mind. We are all stressed and overwhelmed, living through crisis and trauma. And for many of us, the intensity of that trauma is worse because of ableism, because of racism, for all of the different reasons that we move through the world affected by systems and structures and processes that are enormous, indescribable, impossible to begin to comprehend, even though that is the work that we are often engaged in. So let's take that pause, that grounding together. Thank you for sharing in that moment with me. Jess, are you feeling okay? You're muted.
I'm okay. It was a little frantic there for a second, but I'll be okay.
Do you have something to drink?
Oh, thank you for that. 1 second.
And that looks like a very comfy blanket behind you.
I know. Lydia has known me for a long time, so they know my stimming behavior. But
blanket right here.
I have one over here. But it's the water that's really important.
Yes. Hydrating. I have hot chocolate. No, coffee. I'm drinking coffee. I don't even remember what I'm drinking half the time. I'm drinking something.
As Lydia introduced themselves, I should introduce myself also. I am Dr. Jessica Horvath-Williams. I am, as Paige said, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Minnesota. I'm also the vice chair of the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. I am a light-skinned Black person. I'm wearing a purple top. I am in my living room away from my office where my computer is that refuse Zoom. And I have a lot of windows and I have a lovely wooden ceiling and it makes me very happy. So I am sitting on the couch. So you're in my personal space in a way that these meetings typically aren't, but it's gonna be okay.
Jess and I wanted to spend our time in conversation talking about some of the ways that racial, gender, and disability-based oppression operate together, just to give a little bit of grounding and framework. And then we wanted to talk a bit about how we've navigated that as people who are multiply impacted by systems of oppression and who are working as scholars, researchers, advocates, and leaders in this space. I can begin just by outlining a little bit about my understanding of ableism as a necessary underpinning and framework for the conversation that we're going to have today. Some of you are probably already familiar with the concept of ableism. Most people describe it as disability discrimination, as prejudice or bias or bigotry, sometimes as stereotypes. And you may have also heard it described as disability oppression. I understand ableism as a system of structural and institutional oppression, which is a system of power relations and power differentials that embeds certain values and beliefs about which kinds of people are human and which are not. Ableism grants enormous political, social, cultural, and economic power to people whose body minds are understood as whole, healthy, functional, sane, stable, strong, intelligent, and beautiful, at the direct expense of, and while depriving power from, people whose body minds are instead understood as sick, broken, weak, defective, disordered, deficient, deviant, dependent, unstable, dumb, crazy, or ugly. Ableism as a system of values is embedded in, necessary for, and dependent upon every other form of oppression. Ableism and gender-based oppression, patriarchal oppression, misogynistic oppression, transmisogyny, specific experiences of misogyny like misogynoir, misogyny that targets specifically trans women and trans femme people. That's what transmisogyny means, that oppression is rooted in and dependent on ableism. Ableism is rooted in, necessary for, and dependent upon racism, white supremacy, and settler colonialism. The logics of empire, of white supremacist ideology, of racism are deeply wrapped up in and intimately tied to ableism. So all of our conversations can only be understood with a critical and clear understanding of what ableism is and how it shows up. In broader historical terms, ableism, race-based oppression, gender-based oppression, and class-based oppression have always constituted the core formula for determining which people should have access to social services, to healthcare, or even the right to live and take up space and occupy land in the United States. Definitions of value based upon perceived or presumed ableness, competence, or intelligence underlie which people are considered worthy of an education, are considered, quote, contributing to society, and are considered capable of having or expressing sexual desire, acting on reproductive capacity and making reproductive decisions, forming and participating in familial and other intimate relationships, and existing in relation to others in our neighborhoods, our communities, and societies. When we think about gender, race, and disability, this also helps us understand specific disparities and disproportionalities in the ways that disability is attended to within our current social services, health, legal, and educational systems. For example, in schools, children of color, and particularly Black and Brown children, are both likely to be over-identified inaccurately as disabled because of racist ableist beliefs, and likely to be under-identified and not identified at all as disabled, again, also because of racist ableist beliefs. And those disparities and disproportionalities are deeply tied to denial of access to and deprivation of healthcare, of housing, social support and services, and of targeting for criminalization and surveillance, deprivation, and incarceration. I don't know if you want to add to that just a little bit, what you feel is also important to convey.
There's nothing that I want to add. I think what I want to do is kind of unpack a little bit of what you said. So when we think about ableism and we think about racism and sexism and all of the other systems that are supporting each other, that list that Lydia gave at the beginning are often, to put it simplistically, the ways in which we see or we think about disability, those are often used as justifications to invalidate other groups of human, as well as invalidating disabled people. So the example that I often give is that I studied in the 19th century US. So women were thought of both as emotionally labile, as frail, as the weaker sex. Black people were thought of as less intelligent, able to do certain physical tasks and go without sleep in certain ways because of biological reasons that are, of course, nonsense. And so when we think about these other systems that are existing that oppress many groups of people, the justification for those systems often comes from the language of disability. And so that's what Lydia gave was the very, very scaled up. So Lydia gave you the complete way that disability and racism and sexism and all of the isms interlock to create and co-justify each other, and the ways in which those systems are created by other structures that exist in society, are settler colonialism, capitalism and racial capitalism, all of these other systems that are creating social, what's the word? Creating power dynamics in our society that create experiences for certain people, certain groups of people that then create the ways in which we see and know ourselves in the world. Simultaneously, those systems are justifying dehumanizing groups of people and perpetuating the creation of debility, the lack of access to resources, all of these different things, often through the language of disability, which is viewed kind of as the ultimate way to not be human. And so I don't have anything to add. It's more to make some connections in there that show the ways that these things get wrapped up into each other, if that makes sense.
And to expand on that, what you're talking about, the ways in which women have been painted as neurotic or hysterical, prone to irrationality, that's the logic of ableism. It's using disability-based concepts or the language used to justify extraction and exploitation of labor and resources from people of color, Black enslaved people, Native people whose land was stolen and occupied, Chinese immigrants working in mines and on the railroad, and so many other groups of negatively racialized people, is literally rooted in the logic of ableism. Your body exists either as a weaker, diseased or disease-prone body compared to whiteness, or to the extent you are perceived as, for racist reasons, having some specific physical capacity or intellectual capacity, that capacity exists only as both a threat to whiteness and as a resource to be exploited and extracted for the benefit of racialized capital.
And a justification for policing those bodies, like especially in the case, well, I mean, we see it now, but like Lydia talked about Asian American labor. So the idea that Asian American communities at certain points in our history were thought to be disease-ridden was served as the justification for heavily policing those areas, creating laws that limited immigration, all of those. So like these justifications of ableism scale up to the superstructure, the legal structure of our societies that then go back and re-police or perpetuate the policing and the exploitation of those bodies.
When we talk about what happens to queer and trans people, it arises out of the same logic, the same ableism, the same centering and supremacy assigned to whiteness, to masculinity, to heterosexuality. And we can see this just even in the conversations we have about disability, where everybody assumes that by default, if you're talking about disability, you only mean white, straight, male, disabled people. Because ableism and white supremacy and patriarchy operate together to both make disability hypervisible in white people if it means from a pity, charity, medical context, you need help and you're deserving of help, and to make disability only visible in negatively racialized communities, in people who are of minoritized genders or sexualities, if our disability exists as a menace, as a threat, as a danger. And when we think about the ways in which queer, trans, asexual, and aromantic communities have also always been surveilled and criminalized, especially when our queerness or our transness is connected to our race and our culture as not definable or recognizable by white Western expectations about gender and about sexuality, we experience the same type of pathologization using ableist ideas. Queer, trans, asexual, and aromantic people must need to be fixed, must need to be reformed or rehabilitated, literally using that same language or concept of disability. And we can see what that actually results in the fact that for many of us in queer and trans communities, receiving healthcare is a deeply traumatizing and re-traumatizing experience, where healthcare providers, whether of physical healthcare or mental health care, are often active participants in systems that abuse us, that harm us, that deprive us of autonomy and deny us our agency, or even our own self-knowledge or understanding of our own body, minds, of who we are and how we exist in the world. And if you are a disabled, queer and trans person of color, that's amplified because of racist beliefs and racist medical violence, because of ableist beliefs and ableist medical violence that targets us, and because of the ways in which queer and trans people's bodies have always been subjected to medicalization in a dehumanizing way. Again, going back to the idea that just shared, right? That disability is considered one of the most extreme ways to dehumanize a person, to remove somebody from the definition of personhood.
And to give an example of that, that I think is very easy to kind of think through, we often, so when we're thinking about our previous president, the language surrounding his behavior was often that he was, quote, insane, and also that he was a monster,
Or
right?
dumb.
Or dumb. And so this language, they get joined together in very particular ways. We want to say that someone's behavior is unacceptable, so we place them outside of what we view to be humanity, right? So we say that they are monstrous, but we also at the same time say that they are insane or that they are stupid, right? These are not characteristics that we want to own in our human group. His behavior is not something that we think is indicative of humanness. And in fact, it is very human, historically so and currently so, right? This is how human beings act. But the fact that we reject that behavior and we say, no, this belongs over there, and we assign it very ableist language is indicative of these values that are embedded of how we view people who we don't think share our reality, or who, and sharing our reality can be an ableist thing, but it can also be a racist thing. And it can be a lot of different things, right? And so we continue to put those people outside of the definition of human. And when we put people outside of the definition of human, that means that it's okay to do not great things to them because they're not human. And it's a very slippery process because we so easily call someone like that insane. We so easily call them a monster. What are we doing? What kind of violence are we enacting? Not against him, but against all of the other people who have been called that when we say that so casually, because we want to reject someone and reject their perspective. I would caution you, I would urge you to simply reject their perspective, not to label it as inhuman, but to label it as consistent with who we are as human beings, but not something that we are going to engage with.
We also talked about yesterday, just kind of transitioning into a little more conversation when we were preparing for our session about what it means for us to have to move through a world in which we're not considered within the definition of human. And yet, I know for me, and you talked about this a little bit in a different way, so perhaps you can share too, I move through the world as someone who experiences multiple forms of marginalization because I'm openly a non-binary trans person, because I'm openly queer, because I'm openly disabled and multiply neurodivergent, and because I'm an East Asian person of color. And at the same time, I also move through this world with a lot of access to privilege and resources, even if some of those forms of privilege are conditional or contextual. I'm a light-skinned person of color. I hold US citizenship. And while I am certainly disabled, right, I'm a hearing, sighted, and ambulatory disabled person. And so that means I move through the world with certain experiences of relative or absolute privilege. I also move through the world as someone who has a graduate degree, as a lawyer, somebody who has a career. And that's not true of many other multiply marginalized people because of systems, structures, and patterns of deprivation and denial of access. And that means that there are often ways in which I can move through spaces and have a better chance of not being subjected to some of the worst, most overt violence that other people might not have any chance of escaping. That's not a guarantee. My life has not been free of violence or harm by any means, but it means that because of the levels of and types of privilege I have, I'm not always going to be the primary target for the worst kinds of violence. And that's very complicated and difficult for me to navigate. And not enough people really know how to talk about it because it requires nuance to understand what intersectionality is. Because intersectionality as a framework, as it was introduced by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw's original work, helps us understand the ways in which oppression collides, overlaps, and form new and particular experiences of oppression rather than being simple addition. The other part of understanding intersectional analysis is understanding the ways in which people's access to privilege, resources, or power also shape our experiences and the way we move through the world in conjunction with the ways that we move through the world as marginalized people. And some people will call this either with shame or with anger, that if we're able to move through spaces where domination and oppression exist, that we must be somehow playing to respectability. And you and I talked about how that simplification ignores the realities that we have to contend with to survive, where what might look like playing to respectability to somebody else might be in the moment a choice between, am I going to be considered threatening in this particular moment? Can I reduce the likelihood that someone will think of me as dangerous or unstable? Can I reduce the likelihood that I might lose a job and therefore my ability to pay the bills? Can I reduce the likelihood that I will be treated in such a way that it will devastate my mental health, that it will be catastrophic for my life? And those things that we do, using certain language, dressing in a certain way, moving through space and interacting with people in certain ways, can be never a guarantee of safety, but might be something that we do as a way of trying to get through the world to have another day later.
So before I get in too deep, I wish I could like offer a poll, but
We can ask people to answer in the chat. I've been doing this for months now.
Or we can, like, by a show of your virtual hand, how many people have heard the terms or feel comfortable with the terms respectability and respectability politics? Like, is...
4 people have put up their virtual, no, 5 people put up their virtual hands. Okay, we'll give it a minute. 8, 9, 10. Some people keep raising them, putting them down. There's like 10-ish. So like roughly a quarter of people so far have indicated that they are familiar.
Okay, so then let's take a moment of pause and let's talk about respectability. So, respectability politics, I like to think of it like this. Respectability politics is not great. In fact, it's pretty not great. So you know my take on it before we even get there. Respectability politics, set phrase, is the idea that if I mimic dominant behaviors, or if I show to the dominant culture that I am like them in some way, then they will not hurt me. They will give me a job. They will view me like them, and then they will give me rights, is often the trajectory. And what it happens in our communities is that it becomes a kind of, our communities police themselves. We say to young Black men, pull up your pants, right? We say to people who experience police violence, like, well, if he hadn't been wearing X, or if he had been more compliant in very particular ways, if he had like done certain behaviors, then he wouldn't have been shot, assaulted, choked, all of the things. If he had just been a more white kind of Black person, a more recognizable, safe Black person, queer person, trans person, disabled person, it happens in disability community as well. It's not, respectability is everywhere. It's just like, so this idea that if we do that, then the dominant culture will not hurt us and they will give us rights and it's going to be great. Like, so that's respectability politics. It's the idea that through your individual actions, you can somehow dismantle these horrific systems and the problem is that it is also, respectability is also a survival strategy, because the respectability apart from respectability politics is also a survival strategy. So think about being in like, undercover, right? Where you put on the gear and you like get the tats and you go into the thing, like we're in some kind of, like you're infiltrating the mob. How do you be in those spaces but not take on the mentality of them, right? How do you understand how power flows and the ways in which it will do violence against you because of how you are in the world, how you present in the world, whether they can see it or it's apparent to them or not, in order to survive on an individual level without buying into the idea that the respectability politics is going to save us and that this individual action is somehow going to dismantle all of these systems. And it's difficult because the things that we learn to do to survive, we pass those on. And we don't just pass them on as strategies, we pass them on as ideologies, we pass them on as belief systems, right? This protected me, this might protect you. And so the framework of trying to navigate and trying to understand also simultaneously that being able to engage in respectability is a privilege. That's what Lydia's point was. I am a light-skinned, conventionally attractive Black woman. Like, I am very, very feminine. I can use that femininity to navigate certain spaces in ways that people don't see me as a threat, even though they otherwise would, because I'm also kind of like, I have very, not all of my autistic behaviors are visible. Some of them are. And so there are ways in which I violate social norms every day. And so I can play into certain parts of how I look and how I am and how I talk in order to mitigate the ways in which I might be targeted for violence, but I still might be targeted for violence because these systems exist. You're trying to play with respectability, not respectability politics. You're trying to play the odds in very particular ways. And it's an ugly, ugly system. And there are also people who can never engage in respectability. So it's not extendable to all of our communities. And it's a very difficult thing to talk about because respectability isn't cool. Like, it's not great. We shouldn't have to do it. No one should have to police their bodies to the extent that we do in order to be safe, in order to keep body and soul together in a very real way. But we do it. And those of us who have the capability to do it in very particular ways, despite being multiply marginalized, often do. And then we try to help other people. And we often don't do that very well because the strategies that work for us don't necessarily work for everyone. And so I think we wanted to bring up respectability today. One, because it's once again in the media. I will not call him a friend, but a person in my life brought up that many of the white people who have been shot by the police, who have experienced police violence, were having mental health crisis. And where is this in our language of talking about police violence? Why are we only talking about Black people? And it's there because when we talk about ableism, when we talk about the ways that people don't fit, let me scare quote this, in the world, or are viewed to be outside of it, and thus become targets for violence, we are always talking about all of these groups of people. No one should have to experience that. No one should have to lose their life or experience violence because they don't fit in certain ways and thus are viewed as a threat, or thus are viewed as vulnerable to certain moments of power, let's call them that, when you enact power on other people simply because you can. And so there is a complicated relationship between fitting, being able to put on the respectability cloak. And what does that mean to do that on the level of an individual survival, of a family survival, and then also simultaneously understanding that it's ultimately a drop in the bucket, right? And so, and it doesn't help other people get free. And so I hope that we've been able to like nuance that discussion, because you're going to see it again and again in the news with everything that's happening. If X person had only done Y thing that is often more respectable, then that person would not have experienced the violence that they did, which is false. At the same time, sometimes you can get a job by wearing a nice shirt.
Spoiler alert, most of the days I wear t-shirts because I like them. We have a couple of questions that have come in, it looks like. In the Q&A, someone anonymously asked, it's directed to me, but I feel like we both might be able to talk about it. As a person that can be marginalized and a person with privilege, how do you negotiate this? I feel guilt acknowledging my differences because I've also had so many opportunities and my differences are hidden. I would say to that all of your experiences are yours and they're all valid. And this can be true at the same time as it also being true that not all spaces or moments are the right time to talk about all of your experiences. And here's what I mean by that in a concrete way. If you are disabled, if you are queer, if you experience marginalization in any way that is not necessarily readily apparent, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not real or that it's not valid. So if you know you were disabled, even if most people couldn't tell by looking at you, that doesn't mean you're not really disabled or that you're wrong to say that you were disabled. And likewise, if you experience oppression along another axis that isn't necessarily readily apparent to somebody observing externally, that doesn't mean your experience, your community connection, or your identity are wrong to name or to hold or to claim. And at the same time, if a conversation is centered around the pain and the experiences of people who experience a different type of oppression that you don't, that's not the right space to talk about your identity in that moment. So for example, as a multiply disabled person, I have never been institutionalized, and that's a privilege. I've never been institutionalized in any form. And if I'm in a room where there's other disabled people who are talking about having been institutionalized in a psych hospital, a group home, a large-scale developmental disabilities institution, in a prison, and I decide to talk about, well, I haven't had that experience, but I've experienced disability oppression in all these other ways, I'm kind of taking over the conversation in a way that's just not appropriate. But that doesn't mean that I can't talk about the ways that I experience ableist oppression in other contexts. And an analogy that I've used, and I've heard other people use the same kind of analogy before, is if someone tells you, my mother just died of cancer, it is not the right time to say, oh yeah, I had an aunt die of cancer too. Wait, and to start making it about this other story when somebody else is talking about their direct, immediate experience of loss. And that's not because you can never talk about your aunt having died of cancer, but in that particular context, it's not the right time, it's not the right place. And I know that that's a very specific answer to what I feel like can be a much broader question. Mm-hmm. But I think of that as a starting point and thinking, how do I negotiate that? Well, first of all, it's my life. And most people, I don't think people talk about this enough, most people experience both some forms of marginalization and some forms of privilege. Like just by virtue of all of us being here right now today, no matter what other forms of oppression and marginalization anyone here experiences, everyone has the privilege of internet access because we're on Zoom. And I don't know anything else about anybody else's lives besides what a person just shared in the chat about their particular identities. I don't know all those details, but I already know that. And I think that if we try to split the world into who has the most privilege, who has the most experiences, the most marginalization, then we're falling for the trap of trying to create a hierarchy of oppressions or play the oppression Olympics, which is not helpful to anybody, prevents opportunities for solidarity and cross-movement community building. And instead, we need to be able to work on owning the ways in which all of our experiences are shaped by multiple categories of identity and experience.
So I think the only thing that I would like to add to that is I just want to take a moment and pause on that word guilt. Because guilt guilt doesn't help you, and it doesn't help anyone else. um it is why do you feel guilty because you have things that other people don't have? Guilt is not an appropriate response to that. Sharing is an appropriate response to that. So a lot of people come to me, and I'm sure come to Lydia, and try to use us as I'll talk about race because race is easier for me in this instance, because I have a ready example. I am Black, but I do not experience the same kind of oppression because I am a light-skinned Black woman. So when people come to me and try to make me the poster child for Black experiences, I pass them on to other people. I'm like, you don't need to talk to me about this because my experiences in the world are not representative. They are not they are not, you need to talk to my dark-skinned friends. These people experience a more common form of racial oppression about being Black. And they don't get to speak about it because I'm the person that people come to because I'm the comfortable form of being Black. So when you, and that's not on me because that's on their perception of my Blackness. But the moment that I have the privilege, I share, I pass it on, right? Because I know that people are going to come to me. And so I'm going to direct them to other people. So I would argue that that moment of privilege, that moment of having things, means that we pass it on. Not that we redistribute in certain ways, but that we literally become a channel for other people to get the things that they need. So that's all I have to add.
I would actually add to that too, on that same topic of guilt. Now that you mention it, reminded me to bring this up. Guilt is a weapon and a tool of systems of domination and oppression. And it serves to render invisible the mechanics of oppression by placing the onus of oppression on individual people to solve. Guilt simultaneously operates by telling people who hold privilege in a particular context or moment or experience that it is their individual responsibility to disappear oppression simply by being guilty for experiencing privilege. And simultaneously, guilt operates to tell people who are marginalized or oppressed because of a particular context or in part of their identity or their experience that they must feel guilty for surviving, for continuing to live, that we must feel guilty for choosing, quote unquote, to be victims, which is the language that the right will often use, is to say people who talk about marginalization love to be victims. It's a contest to see who can be the bigger victim. The feeling of guilt operates to tell us both that our existence is the problem and that the solution to the issues we face is for us individually to solve oppression, as if it can be an individual problem to be solved.
And that is the thread with both ableism and respectability politics that we were talking about earlier, right? Because America is a very individualistic society, and that would be a whole nother huge conversation because get me on some individualism and I have things to say. But
I also know we've got two other people with hands up.
No, okay, I'm gonna answer the questions. The point is, no, I'll come back to it later. Anyway, yes.
It looks like Emily Scott and Alex Michelli. Go ahead, Emily. You can unmute.
I'm sorry, I left my hand up from the last question about respectability. My bad.
No problem. And Alex, did you have a question?
I was the same as Emily. My bad as well. Sorry.
No problem. Jess, you were making a point. Did you want to finish your point?
I was just saying that this idea of individualism, that we will, of our individual actions, fix oppression of any sort, is like, it runs through all of these different way. It runs through respectability politics. It's one of the ways that ableism operates in the world. Yeah, it's a thing. So I just wanted to make that connection back. We also had a question that Paige sent us about environmental racism and toxic dumping. And Grace has a question too, but it was the environmental racism, toxic dumping, and how do we talk about the debilitating effects of that and disabling effects of that, while also being respectful of autistic people and autistic community. And that's something that we often, like, we talk about in disability spaces a lot. But the short answer is that when impairment is caused by oppressive structures, we say that's not we condemn the oppressive structures that have caused the impairment, but we do not condemn the impairment. So we have to separate the two from each other. And now when we make certain arguments, we say that these oppressive structures caused impairment and thus caused harm, but the impairment in and of itself is not the problem. It is the structures that caused the impairment, because we don't have a society that supports impaired and disabled and debilitated people, and that only certain groups of people experience that. We don't have toxic dumps in suburbs. That's just not a thing that happens. So thinking about disconnecting that and making sure that when we use language, or when we're using our language, we're making a very clear distinction between that the cause, that the oppression, that the systems, that the toxic dumping, that the capitalism, that all of those things, those are the things that are the problem. And that they only produce impairment and debilitation in certain groups of people. And we have no problem with impaired people. We have a problem with the forces that cause the impairment, because it redistributes or distributes life chances unequally.
And this is literally the conversation we have to be having about how part of how ableism and white supremacy work is that environmental racism and racialized capitalism literally create and exacerbate disability. Mm-hmm. Like the examples you're giving about where toxic dump waste dump, you know what I mean? And I'm not going to put those words in the right order, like where those places of biohazards are. Places of biohazards, that needs to be the new euphemism, except it's not really a euphemism. And how that literally means that disability is more prevalent in every marginalized and oppressed community compared to every analogously privileged and resourced community. Oh, Grace is raising a hand.
Great kind of question.
Hi, Grace.
Am I unmuted?
You're
Yes.
unmuted.
Okay. Well, I have to go soon because I have a meeting with the consumer, but I can just ask and then you can answer it and then I can watch it later. But thank you for being here, first of all. But I was gonna ask, earlier y'all were saying about how like it's good to pass things on, and that is good, but like what if the person that you're sending them to doesn't want to have to be educating people all the time?
Oh, no. Okay. Yep, that makes sense. Let's nuance that. So we don't sending a person to a person.
Yeah.
That requires the consent of the other person. I am saying in that moment, I refuse to be a representative for all Black people because I am a light-skinned Black person and my experiences are not the same. And therefore, if you want to have this conversation, you need to be attempting at least to having it with a group of people that are experiencing Blackness in a very different way than I am. I am not representative. So I'm not necessarily passing them on to my friend over here. I am saying I refuse to be your spokesperson for Blackness, and Black people who are dark-skinned should be the spokespeople for Blackness. First, my voice can be added to that conversation, but I have too much privilege because I am light-skinned for that to be an appropriate conversation.
And this is Lydia. I would add to that by saying, when we say send people to other people, I am also very clear about for what and what type of consent is necessary. So if a reporter contacts me, which has happened, and says, can you please comment as an expert on this issue that pretty much only affects trans women? I'm not a trans woman. I will give the names of public advocates who are trans women. Because that is a different thing than saying, here is the name of a trans woman who I personally know, who is not necessarily doing any public work on issues that affect trans women, may not be out as trans. I'm saying, here are the names of people that are very well known to the public, who do public work and for whom advocacy is a general part of their life. You should contact them. And because this is the context of a media request, those particular people will know, because this is work that they do, that if they don't have energy or time, they can ignore the media request or decline it should they so choose. But that's a very specific example. If instead it's a personal conversation where someone is asking me, well, Lydia, can you explain to me exactly how cerebral palsy works? And I don't have cerebral palsy, I'm not going to say, here are the names of all of the leading advocates who have cerebral palsy in the public who are probably not consenting to talk to a person they've never met. It's for a purpose that's not for an otherwise public purpose related to their advocacy. But I might say, here are some websites, here are some articles that are written by advocates with cerebral palsy if you want to learn more about this particular experience that I can't really tell you much beyond basic information.
And I would add to that, in the first category, we also send people to organizations that is the work that they do, not necessarily just individuals, because organizations often have more resources and they have people that is their job to have those conversations when those conversations are necessary. And then the second point stands as such. The other thing that I would say about that is the important moment, and this is the example that I am trying to give here in using my own privilege. And if I'm not saying this well, I apologize, but it is the moment of refusal, not just to speak to something that doesn't affect you personally, because Lydia is not a trans woman. I am a Black woman, but I am not going to speak. I am not going to be representative. I'm not going to allow myself to be representative of Black experience, because that's the move. The move is to make people who look like me representative of Black experience in a way that is false. And so I am refusing that moment. So if someone wants to come and talk to me about other experiences that I have, that's fine. But I refuse at that moment to be used to further hurt the Black community by being held up as representative. That is unacceptable to me. And therefore, I will pass those people on, exactly as Lydia is saying, to other resources. But I am the moment of refusal. And that's what I'm advocating for.
And just another example of that, like how that shows up in my life, is people might ask me to be representative of all autistic people in an area where they're focusing on the rights and communication access of non-speaking autistic people. I'm not non-speaking. Or of autistic people who've been institutionalized, the example I mentioned earlier. Or where I'm asked to be a representative of all Asian communities, and I'm not. I am East Asian and I am a representative of my experiences, but if I'm the only person asked to be present, then that is actually furthering the erasure of darker skinned Asians, of mixed race Asians, of Southeast Asians, of South Asians, of Asians who are generationally poor, of Asians who are second generation or first generation immigrants, of Asians who have any number of experiences that I don't. And so we always have to be very particular in what opportunities we are willing to participate in, where we need to pass the mic, and where we need to expand the table.
100%.
Wow. I really hate to cut this off, y'all, but I realize that we're past the hour mark. I'm feeling all of this and taking this in, and I hope that others are as well. I know that I plan at least to go back and listen to the recording and really sit with your words. Thank you both for leading us in this conversation and sharing. I'm really excited for well, we have 2 more coffee talks coming up. One next week, but then our final one specifically will offer the opportunity to interact with Jess and Lydia again through some dynamic breakout groups where we'll have the opportunity to where everyone can again sit with, I think, what we heard and listened to today, but have the opportunity to think about how in our professional and personal lives, how we can meaningfully elevate the voices of autistic individuals, not just during April, throughout the year and in all settings. So I really hate to cut this off. This has been so wonderful. So thank you to Jess and to Lydia and to our wonderful captioner as well. Thank you to everyone who is here and for sticking around. It's absolutely wonderful. We'll follow up with the recording if people want to sit and listen again. But thank you all so much. I hope that everyone is feeling good and feeling balanced after this conversation. Thank you all so much. Bye.